In this lecture, you'll learn about NetApp VSC. That's the Virtual Storage Console. It's a software plugin for VMware vSphere that allows you to manage your ONTAP storage from the vSphere client. And if you are using ONTAP storage in a VMware environment, it's highly recommended that you do use it. The virtual appliance for VSC, VASA provider, and SRA, commonly known just as VSC, is a vSphere software plugin that allows administrators to directly manage NetApp storage via the vSphere client. So the easiest way to understand this is actually just to look at it. So let's do that right now. So I've got a web browser open here. I've got the vSphere client open, and I've already installed the VSC plugin in here. Because I've got it installed, if I go to the menu here, you see that a new menu item is available, which is the Virtual Storage Console, and there is the NetApp icon. So I can click on that, and that will open up VSC. It lands on the overview page by default. I'll go through all the other pages here as we go through this section. I'm just giving you an overview right now, though. So on the overview page, you can see that you can discover and add your ONTAP storage systems. Once you've got that done, you can provision a data store using VSC. So you saw earlier in this section when I configured this manually that I had to configure settings in the vSphere client, and I also had to configure settings in the ONTAP storage directly as well. When you use the VSC, the configuration is pushed over from the vSphere client. So you don't need to touch the ONTAP settings. They're all going to be configured for you from here. So that makes the administration easier because you're not having to configure both sides. You just do it in one place and everything gets pushed across. Also, when you use VSC, when this is configured, you know that it's going to be done with the best practice settings all set up for you automatically. So you can provision data stores from here. Let's just take a quick look at that. So I'll click on the provision button here, and you can see I can create a new data store, and I can either create a traditional NFS or VMFS data store, or I can create the newer type of a vVol data store. We'll cover what vVol data stores are later in this section. So that's where you can do the provisioning. You do all the settings in here, and those configuration will get pushed across to the ONTAP side as well. And also your clients over here in vSphere, your ESXi hosts, will be automatically added to the storage. So it makes things a lot more convenient. It's easier than doing it manually. And also, you know, you're going to get consistent best practice results from doing it in here. You can also monitor your storage from here as well. So still in the overview page, I was on the Getting Started tab there. I'll click on Traditional Dashboard, and in here, you can see an overview. You can see reports in here. So I can see information on my space utilization, also on my deduplication and compression in here as well. I can view my data stores, I can see my virtual machines, and I can see performance statistics on them as well. So very useful for convenient monitoring in here. Also, I can see my ESXi hosts. And in here, if any of my hosts are not using the recommended best practice settings, it will tell me about it in here, and I can click on them here and I can set those best practice settings from VSC. Again, this is much easier than doing it manually, and also it will continuously monitor them. So if any of those settings get changed accidentally later, I'm going to see in here that that host is no longer compliant with the best practice settings. And again, I can fix that from here. So it just gives you very convenient and consistent configuration of your ONTAP storage for VMware from the vSphere client. Okay, so that's what VSC is. Let's go back onto the slides again. So as I was just saying there, it provides integrated ease of administration because the plugin is installed into the vSphere client, and it helps ensure those best practice settings both on the storage side and also on the ESXi host side as well. So because of that, NetApp highly recommend you use the software if using VMware with ONTAP storage. I did show you earlier in this section that you don't need to use VSC. You can configure settings manually, but it's recommended that you do use VSC. So talking now about how you actually get this installed. So the UVA product suite includes 3 components. That is VSC, the virtual storage console, the NetApp VASA provider, and the VMware SRA storage replication adapter. As we go through this lecture, I'll explain what each of those 3 components does. The UVA is downloaded and runs as a single OVA virtual appliance. So the UVA is the unified virtual appliance, which includes those 3 components. You download it as a single OVA virtual appliance. You then install that easily into your vSphere environment, and then all 3 components are available to you. So the way that it used to be done was that each of those 3 components used to come as a separate software package, and you had to download and install them separately, which was a bit inconvenient. But now with the new EVA, it comes as a single virtual appliance, and it all gets installed in one go, which makes it easy to do the installation. The NetApp VASA provider and VMware SRA storage replication adapter, that was the last 2 of the 3 components, are optional plugins which work with the VSC. The VASA provider is enabled by default. In the latest version, SRA is not. Okay, so let's talk about those 3 components. First one was VSC, the virtual storage console. And when we're talking about the entire appliance in general, usually we're just going to call it the VSC. So VSC provides data store provisioning with best practice settings. All of the different types of data stores that can be configured through the VSC. It also gives you configuration of the host settings on your ESXi hosts, again with the best practice settings. It provides monitoring for best practice setting changes on both your data stores and on the ESXi hosts. If you're going to install the NetApp VAAI plugin, you're going to do that from VSC. Remember, we spoke about VAAI earlier in this section. That offloads some tasks from your ESXi hosts, makes things more efficient, gives you better performance. And it also gives storage performance monitoring and predefined reports for your data stores and virtual machines. Now, in previous versions of VSC, it also had a backup and recovery capability built into it as well. But that has been removed now since VSC version 7, because the integrated backup and recovery is now managed by SnapCenter. vSphere and VSC supports both SAN and NAS NFS protocols for the data stores. VSC can create and manage traditional NFS version 3 and version 4.1 data stores on an ONTAP volume. It can also create and manage traditional SAN data stores using iSCSI, Fiber Channel, or FCOE with VMFS5 and VMFS6 on an ONTAP LUN. And VSC can also create and manage SAN and NAS vVol data stores. I'll talk about vVol data stores later in this section. So you saw earlier that we can manually provision traditional data stores with NFS, iSCSI, Fiber Channel, and FCOE. vVols can only be done with VSC though. So if you want to use vVols, you want to have VSC installed. When you provision an NFS data store, VSC creates an NFS volume on the storage system and then updates the export policies. If you remember from earlier in the section when I showed you how to do it manually, I had to manually create the volume on the ONTAP system. I also had to manually set the export policies there as well. And I had to specify the IP addresses of my ESXi hosts in the export policy. Well, when you use VSC, VSC already knows about your ESXi hosts because it is a vCenter plugin, and obviously vCenter knows about the ESXi hosts. So when you provision an NFS data store, it's going to automatically create the export policy for you with the IP addresses of your hosts. Saves you doing it manually, so it's less work for you. Also makes sure there's not going to be errors when the export policy is configured. When you provision a VMFS data store, when you're using a SAN protocol, VSC again will create the new volume for you over on the ONTAP system, or you can use an existing volume if selected. It then creates the LUN in that volume as well, and it also does the iGroup for you. So similar to the export policy being done for you when you're using NFS, also the I group is done for you when you are using a SAN protocol. You saw earlier when I did it manually, I had to go and check the IQNs of my ESXi hosts, and I had to manually add them all into an I group. Well, when you use VSC, again, vSphere already knows the IQNs of the ESXi hosts, so it will automatically create the I group with the correct settings for you. And with a single click, you can make the data store available to all the ESXi hosts in a data center, all the hosts in a cluster, or individual hosts. So you can set it at any of those levels. Again, when I did it manually, when I was using iSCSI, I had to go to each individual host and I had to configure the iSCSI software adapter there to connect it into the LUN. I had to do that individually for each host. When you're using VSC, you can have all of your hosts automatically connected into the LUN and able to use that data store. Okay, so that was VSC. The next component is the VASA provider. The VASA provider provides information to the vCenter server instance about the NetApp storage systems that are being used in the VMware environment. So it gives communication between the vCenter server and the ONTAP storage. The ONTAP storage will explain its capabilities to the vCenter server. So it can see what kind of performance is available on there, if deduplication and compression, thin provisioning, and so on is available on the ONTAP storage system. It also translates between the NetApp and the vSphere APIs. And as I just said, vCenter learns the capabilities of the storage. The VASA provider also manages vVol provisioning and management. So if you want to use vVols, you do have to provision that from VSC. And to provision vVols from VSC, the VASA provider has to be enabled. It is enabled by default, but you can turn it off if you want to. VASA provider manages optional storage capability profiles that define different storage service level objectives for your environment as well. You can then use those SLOs to select a data store with the correct storage attributes when provisioning virtual machines. So it's the VASA provider that provides the information from the storage system into vSphere. Because vSphere learns that information, it can then use storage capability profiles so that when you provision a virtual machine, you can specify the storage settings that you want to have for that particular storage machine. So you can specify the performance that you want for that virtual machine. So let's say that I've got a particular virtual machine that I need to have high performance for, and another virtual machine that I don't require high performance for, it can have lower performance. VASA provider makes that very easy because you can have different profiles enabled in vSphere, and then when you provision the virtual machine, you can specify the profile and it will get the capabilities that you want for that virtual machine. So it automates the process of this. It makes it very simple. You just set it up ahead of time. And then when you provision the virtual machine, you just specify the profile you want to use. That's a lot easier than having to do it manually on a virtual machine by virtual machine basis. And finally, VASA provider also manages alarms to notify you when a volume or an aggregate is nearing full capacity, or when a data store is no longer in compliance with its associated storage capability profile. Okay, so as I said, the NetApp VASA provider is optional, but you do have to have it enabled if you want to have vVol provisioning and management, storage capability profiles, and storage capability profile and capacity alarms. And again, it is enabled by default in the latest version of VSC. On a related note, so you need to have the VASA provider enabled if you want to provision vVol data stores. If you also want to have the vVol dashboard and vVol reports available, you also have to install OnCommand API services. Okay, so let me say that again. You do not need OnCommand API services to provision vVols. You just need the VASA provider. But if you also want the dashboard and the reports, then you need the VASA provider and you need OnCommand API services as well. So if you are using vVols, for sure you're going to want the reports, so you do have to also install OnCommand AP services. OnCommand AP services is separate software. it does not come with that OVA file that you install VSC for. So with OnCommand API services, it's a separate software download, it's a separate installation. You need to install it on a Linux host. That Linux host is probably going to be running as a virtual machine in your VMware environment. Okay, the last component is SRA, the Storage Replication Adapter. SRA integrates with VMware SRM Site Recovery Manager for automated disaster recovery. So VMware SRM, that is a software package you can get from VMware, and what it's used for is for disaster recovery. When you're using SRM, if you do have a failure at your main site, it provides an easy and fast way to fail your virtual machines over to your disaster recovery site. If you're using ONTAP storage in your VMware environment, then obviously this is going to be part of your disaster recovery failover. So with NetApp SRA, that integrates with the VMware SRM, and it controls the snap mirror functionality for VMware SRM. It allows you to recover data stores and virtual machines in the event of a failure at your main site. Let's go back to that slide again. So the VASA provider, it is very commonly used when you are using VSC. So the VASA provider is now enabled by default in the latest version, didn't used to be in earlier versions. SRA, less likely that you will be using that. You're only going to use it if you are using VMware SRM. So SRA is disabled by default, but you can enable it from within the VSC interface. Okay, last thing to talk about is RBAC, the role-based access control. Because you were maybe thinking when I showed you earlier about how VSC works, well, okay, that's great that I can configure my storage from the vSphere client, but what if I've got a team of VMware engineers and I've got a separate team of NetApp storage engineers? Do I really want my VMware administrators to be able to configure and do everything on the storage? Maybe I want to have some separation of control there. And yes, that is possible because RBAC is supported. So VSC supports role-based access control at 2 levels. So you can specify what access to the storage your VMware administrators are going to get. So with RBAC, you can control your vSphere objects, such as virtual machines and data stores. They're managed using the vCenter RBAC functionality. You can also control the access, the rights and permissions that the administrators are going to have to the ONTAP storage, and that is managed by ONTAP's built-in RBAC. When you add your ONTAP storage systems into VSC, you can add individual SVMs by adding their management IP addresses as well as ONTAP clusters in VSC. So let's say that, like what we're using in the lab, I've got cluster 2. When you add that to VSC, obviously you need to have the storage system added into VSC before it can see it and then make changes on it. So when you add the storage system into VSC, you can add it at the cluster level. You can also add individual SVMs. So we had our cluster 2 cluster, and in there we had the NAS SVM and also the SAN SVM as well. So if I add it at the cluster level by adding the cluster management IP address, then VSC will see all of the SVMs. It will see both the NAS and the SAN SVMs in our example. But I could also add the SAN SVM itself by its management address, and then it's only going to see the SAN SVM. It's not going to see the NAS SVM. And adding individual SVMs rather than at the cluster level provides support for multi-tenant SVM level administration. But the VASA provider only works with cluster level credentials. So when you've got SVMs added into VSC, you're not going to have the full functionality there. It doesn't support the VASA provider functions. So more likely, you're going to have it added in at the cluster level. Okay, that was everything I needed to tell you here in our overview of VSC. As we go through the rest of the lectures in this section, I'll show you how to configure everything using it. Thanks for watching. Before you go, I'm excited to let you know about my new ONTAP 9 Storage Complete course. It's available this week for special discount launch pricing, but the cart closes this Friday, the 18th October. I'll put a link at the top of the description below where you can find out all the details.